Then I'll hand over the floor to Professor Kowalski.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Greetings to everyone present. My name is Ankit Malhotra. I am the co-founder and president of the Jindal Society of International Law. The Jindal Society of International Law was created under the aegis of the Center for the Study of United Nations under the expert guidance and tutelage of Professor Dr. Weston Wapowski in the year 2020, and was launched formally by Herbert and Rose Rubin Professor of International Law, Professor Jose Enrique Alvarez of New York University, along with the Vice Chancellor of our university, Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar, and a dear friend of the society, Professor Dr. Mohan Kumar. The purpose of this society is to increase the student interaction with the subject matter of international law through its various initiatives. The society attempts to bridge the lacuna by streamlining resources and inculcating an overall interest in the vast expanses of international law. We pride and we aim to provide this larger space to young international law enthusiasts to nurture their interest in this field. The spring lecture series of 2022, entitled The Colloquium on Challenges to Global Governance and Humanities in the 21st Century, offers a compendium of scholarship from the bar and also from the academy. Over the past year, the Jindal Society of International Law has hosted members from the United Nations, the Hague Academy of International Law, the International Law Commission, multinational law firms and corporations, and also other foreign universities of high reputation. Through our previous series, we endeavored to study the different contours of international law through the speakers who covered and addressed various aspects of research based on their practice and also their teachings. Given the vast ecosystem and engagement of international law in it, the society aimed to study the fragmentation and fertilization of the public and private international law spheres it sought to tackle. Over the years, the society has become a quorum of thought-provoking discussions due to its explorations in these areas of international law. Thus, as a result, through the spring lecture series, it is important to understand the law and its challenges from broader, different, and differing vantage points. Acknowledging international law as a creation of states, it is also important to appreciate the social and sciences and humanities that have played a key role in shaping this law. Thus, broader study becomes crucial and also critical. To talk about the United Nations and the reform of the United Nations in these trying times, in these times of war, we have experts from all across the globe, and we are so delighted, honored, and also privileged to be able to do this. First, we have amongst us the author of a paper on reforming the United Nations Security Council, Professor Dr. Weston Wapowski, who from 2004 till 2014 worked as a senior academic officer at the United Nations University in Tokyo. Prior to that, he was a senior legal expert for the EU project, Legal Protection of Individual Rights in Russia, the lecturer at the University of Exeter, and also a diplomat of the Bulgarian embassy in London and in New York. We're so delighted to have him amongst us. Then we also have amongst us Professor Maya Groff, who is an international lawyer based in The Hague and is a convener of the Climate Change Governance Commission, which seeks to propose a high-impact global governance innovations adequate to meet the climate change challenges. As a principal legal officer, she was previously worked on the development and administration of multiple multilateral treaties, as well as at international criminal tribunals, and has taught at the Hague Academy of International Law, and is currently a visiting professor at Leiden University, Faculty of Global Governance and Global Affairs, and is a graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and McGill Universities, and she is an attorney admitted to practice in the state of New York, formerly working in a corporate law space. There's amongst us, we also have Professor Jennifer Trahan, who is a clinical professor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs, and where she directs the concentration in international law and human rights and teaches a variety of courses on international law. She's a prolific scholar, having authored scores of law review articles and book chapters, including on the International Criminal Court's crime of aggression. Her book, Existing Legal Limits to Security Council Veto Power in the Face of Atrocity Crimes, was published in the summer by Cambridge University Press. She also recently served as amicus curiae to the ICC on the appeals to the situation regarding Afghanistan, and serves on this Council of Advisors on the application of the Rome Statute to cyber warfare. We also have amongst us Professor Mr. Bruce Rashcroft, who is an expert, legal expert and consultant on international law, particularly as it pertains to the United Nations, senior advisor to the American Bar Association's United Nations Representative Committee at the ABA's International Law Section Executive Council, and a member of the American Association of International Law Executive Council. Mr. Rashkov worked in the government as a career civil servant from 1970, except for the period between 1995 and 2005, during which he served with the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs. Mr. Rashkov has participated on behalf of the Department of Justice in the development of the 1982 UN Law of the Sea Convention. In 1982, he was also brought over to the Office of Legal Affairs in the Department of State to head an office preparing a case of the United States in the World Court with Canada overnight in the adjacent seas and seabeds, and stayed on afterwards to deal with matters. Mr. Rashkov became the principal lawyer in the office of responsible for, which is the office which is responsible for issues relating to the diplomatic privileges and immunities of foreign missions and diplomats in the United States, including in regards to the United Nations and international organizations headquartered in New York. Last, and someone with whom I've shared an extremely long relationship in my studies with international law, is Professor Richard Kaplan, who is a professor of international relations and an official fellow of the Lanar's College. His principal research interests are concerned with international organizations and conflict management, with a particular focus on peacekeeping and post-conflict situations and state building. He is author or an editor of several books, among them Europe's New Nationalism, States and Minorities in Conflicts, published by Oxford University Press, A New Trusteeship, The International Administration of War-Torn Territories. He's also written on the situation in Yugoslavia and also on new states which have been created. His most recent book is Measuring Peace, Principles, Practices, and Politics. Professor Kaplan has held various fellowships and received grants by the British Academy, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Folk Bernadotte Academy, and others as well. We're so grateful to all our panelists for taking out time to do this on a busy day. We'll start with Professor Popowski and then follow the order which has been decided. Professor, the floor is now all yours.
Thank you, Ankit. Thank you to the Jindal Society for bringing this excellent panel on a topic which cannot be more timely to discuss, having in mind the Russian aggression into Ukraine. I often am asked those days to comment on the relevance of the United Nations. People are very distressed and disappointed, frustrated, so am I. But my answer still is that exactly because what's happening in Ukraine, we need the United Nations more than ever. The organization which was created back in 1945 to save the future generations from the scourges of war. And we open the news every morning and we see the scourges of war in front of our eyes. in Ukraine. And that's why we have to unite our forces, and I mean academics as all of us, to discuss the topic of why the United Nations has not delivered to the expectations and what can we do next. Without further ado, I will go, we will have each of our speakers talking first, and then we will engage in roundtable discussion. So first of all, yes, a very dear friend, Maya Groff, who published a book on the global governance institutions and the reform. Please, Maya, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Veselin and Ankit, for this forum and the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So firstly, I just would like to commend the organizers of the event on the framing of the roundtable, namely, quoting the flyer, while political barriers to change are hard to overcome, imagining transformations can spur discussion in helpful ways and identify areas where fresh attention is needed. So that's just to say that I very much agree that facilitating dialogue on possible global governance transformations, even very significant transformations, I think is a vital exercise, particularly in the light of the intersecting global challenges and risks we currently face. And of course, as Professor Popovsky alluded to, the current crisis in Ukraine, this backdrop, which is really framing our discussion today, shows how these macro hard security and geopolitical risks are still very much alive and may, of course, also even intensify, multiply further beyond Ukraine. And this doesn't mean that other geopolitical tensions go away. I have heard some commentators note that currently at the moment, in terms of the possibility of a nuclear exchange, that is a MAD scenario, mutually assured destruction, we might be currently at the most dangerous situation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So indeed, very dangerous international situation. And we're seeing, it's illuminating how fragile and incomplete, I would say, our current international security and global weapons governance frameworks are, which are still not yet fit for purpose to really prevent these dangers that we're confronting in terms of the hard security and geopolitics. Then adding to this risk environment, we have, of course, the climate and ecological crises that we're facing, which are a new kind of biophysical system, planetary system security, indeed the whole Earth system on which we depend for our civilizations, for life and the flourishing of our societies to date. We know that we have been overstepping a number of these defined scientific planetary boundaries, climate, biodiversity, two of them. So the very basis for life on Earth and our societies flourishing is at risk. And in this case, in this context, through the lens of global governance, and in particular the UN system and the Charter, indeed the very core provisions of the Charter, I don't think policymakers have yet internalized the nature of these novel ecological challenges that we face. Just to quote a little bit of science, the recent IPCC reports show we have reached the warmest temperature on Earth in the last 100,000 years. And many of you will have read also that the consequences, the effects of the already changes in the global climate are occurring much faster and are more extreme than scientists had predicted according to their best available models. Also, planetary Earth scientists have noted that 9 out of the 12 biophysical systems that are responsible for regulating global climate have started to shift much sooner, many decades sooner than had been predicted. And even if the international community reaches the more ambitious 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limitation target in the Paris Agreement, this very likely commits all future generations to at least 2 meters of sea level rise with very dramatic consequences. So we're not only addressing, the hard security issues, the large-scale interstate conflict which we see now. This is not only that is stalled at the UN Security Council, but also, meaningful climate, ecological, and security discussion. But for this latter, there are concerns raised, of course, that the current Security Council is without the appropriate mandate and is not fit for purpose for the complexity and a whole of system kind of issues that climate and related ecological crises are. Yet scientists note that we are indeed in a state of planetary emergency. So fresh ideas and discussion is very badly needed, and also an open discussion about where we are headed as an international community and whether our core global governance architecture is really up to the task. So that was really the goal, excuse me, of the 2020 book that Veselin mentioned, published by Cambridge University Press. And the key proposals there came out of this international prize launched by a Swedish foundation where academic and expert review panels all around the world reviewed about almost 3,000 proposals from many, many countries, looking for a new comprehensive system, global governance system, to manage the range of global catastrophic risks, which we now see materializing, in fact, in confronting us. So a key premise of the book is that if we increase the governance integrity of the entire international system, we then, of course, increase the ability to manage the various individual issues. And a key issue within the book is looking at the UN Charter. We know likely as scholars of the UN and the Charter that under Article 109.3, within 10 years, it was envisioned that a review conference would be held to review the 1945 Charter, and the P5 veto issue in particular was an issue in San Francisco. It remains, of course, an issue to today. And that review, of course, was not held. So it's 76 plus years later, and here we are grappling with the current circumstances that we're in. So I won't go through all of the proposals from our book in the interest of time. The book is available on the website of the Cambridge University Press for free. It's open access because we did want to start this dialogue and discussion. But it sketches out, what we thought. It was an interdisciplinary team. I was the international lawyer on the team. We sketched out the next logical steps to increase our overall governance capacity as an international community, and not because these changes we think are politically possible now, but because we feel that certain upgrades of this sort will likely simply become necessary at a certain juncture, based on the circumstances which are confronting us. So just to quickly, in the time allotted, just go through a few of the main proposals. The international rule of law proposals are dear to my heart, of course, and we suggest a sort of international rule of law package upgrade. The International Court of Justice itself, the principal legal organ of the UN, has not had substantial reform since adoption of the Charter. Chapter 6, likewise, was meant to be a real core provision or the cardinal principle of the UN Charter, and it has had insignificant attention. That's on peaceful settlement of disputes, and that could also be enhanced and improved. We make other suggestions like upgrading the UN human rights architecture, also very, very logical to take it to its next level. And then we have a few suggestions to help this international legal system get to the next level of quality, efficiency, effectiveness with the Judicial Training Institute and some other suggestions. We talk about Article 6 and Article 43 of the Charter. Primarily, these articles deal with the UN Security Council's tasks. They were tasked with making proposals for a general system of arms control and disarmament, and also to conclude these agreements for to make sure collective security decisions could be implemented with armed forces agreements between members. So this is unfinished business that is in the core of the Charter that, again, we think should obviously be taken forward. We talk about enhancing the legislative capacity of the UN system, also proposing a transitional World Parliamentary Assembly, which could drive a more people-centered and vibrant discourse at the UN. We have a chapter on a more reliable and enhanced funding mechanism for the UN, roughly modeled on the European Union funding model. And for the UN Security Council, we add another proposal to the many, many proposals for UN Security Council reform with a system of weighted votes based on a formula of combined GDP, population, and a UN membership share to be reviewed regularly. So based on some, mathematical, more objective criteria in terms of weighting of votes, and without the veto, with 24 seats. And we would envision this to be a more of an executive council with expert advisory groups or sub-councils on various fundamental security issues, including human security issues. So this sort of what we're suggesting it has some linkages and overlap with what Veselin is suggesting, what Foggs has suggested for a Global Resilience Council. But the point we really want to make is that there should be a paradigm shift. There shouldn't just be adding more seats to the council. There should be a paradigm shift for depoliticization, fairness, and functionality that is in line with modern current norms of governance legitimacy. So indeed, these recent events have shed light on the need for such fundamental shifts towards legitimacy and transparency at the Council, Security Council. Many of you might have heard of this proposal by Liechtenstein is leading an effort with a group of small and mid-sized countries, including Costa Rica, Estonia, Ireland, Mexico, New Zealand, Qatar, Sweden, to press for the adoption of a UN General Assembly resolution that would automatically require the General Assembly to meet after a permanent member casts a veto, and also invite the Security Council to submit a report on the use of the veto in question. So this is quite an extraordinary proposal, which I understand from my contacts will be moving forward in terms of tabling at the General Assembly. And I also would like to quote a Ukrainian scholar, professor, previously teaching at Kiev, now teaching in the US at a law school. She says there was an op-ed in the LA Times. Her quote is, "In the 20th century, when people talked about reforming the UN, it was an academic exercise. Today, changes are simply unavoidable. We are at the point of no return." So recent events are really shedding the light on the weaknesses that a lot of the drafters of the 1945 Charter already knew were there. And we have these really intense intersecting challenges. And this is quite extraordinary, these proposals of emanating from the General Assembly. But also, I think something very encouraging is this very this very swift recourse to justice institutions and justice mechanisms in relation to the Ukraine situation, with the ICC, already opening an investigation with an unprecedented referral of the situation by 40 states to the court. Ukraine is also petitioning the International Court of Justice. It's been floated the idea, including by the UK Prime Minister, for an ad hoc justice mechanism to prosecute the crime of aggression, et cetera. So I think this is also revealing how fundamental this international legal architecture is. And in my view, of course, it should be strengthened further and really become even more of the backbone of our global relations in service of our common global interest. So I'll stop there in terms of the time allotment. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Excellent start. And as you mentioned, and this moment of urgency today, how it will play with what we had already seen as a process of reform will be quite interesting to see whether that will stimulate the reform or on the opposite, because the world might be so divided, particularly the big powers, whether that might be actually a jeopardy to the reform. My question to you, Maya, later, not now, after listening to everybody else, will be, how do you read the Secretary General report, Our Common Agenda? from your book. In other words, what was the encouraging and disappointing in the report of the Secretary General in September in terms of your expectations, and what was the report ambitious enough, again, comparing to what you suggested in the book. But now let's move to Jennifer Trahan and her book, and focusing more about the Security Council as a primary organ of international peace and security. Jennifer, your time.
Great, thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you for inviting me. So my book is basically looking at the use of the veto power while there's ongoing atrocity crimes, by which I mean genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So unlike the more expansive ideas of reforming the UN system, it basically assumes we're stuck with the system for now that we have, and how can we ameliorate some of the most harmful practices. So it starts going back historically, tracing the early drafts of what became the UN Charter. And these were negotiations between the US, UK, and Soviet Union primarily, where the Soviets were insisting on what they at that time called the principle of unanimity. And the US and UK were initially hesitant, particularly if the country who would be voting was involved in the situation. They wanted a carve out, but then they ultimately acquiesced to the Soviet version, at least under Chapter 7. When they reached San Francisco, there was extensive pushback against the veto power, and ultimately, however, there's the famous anecdote that the US representatives said, you know, you can tear up your charter if you don't want our veto power, and in went the veto power. On, I think, the assumption that the permanent members needed to be aligned in the use of force. But I think we're seeing vetoes in many, many contexts that it was completely unclear that the drafters would have countenanced any of this. And I will suggest even in 1945, it's not an unlimited veto power, because it says very clearly the Security Council has to adhere to the UN's purposes and principles. And these frame all of the powers that the Council has as a whole and individual members have. And of course, no individual members have the ability to violate international law or use cogans. My book focuses on vetoes cast while there are ongoing atrocity crimes and questions the legality of these vetoes. So let me give some illustrations. If we go back to the apartheid era in South Africa, we see US, UK, and French vetoes basically delaying the dismantlement of apartheid. It is the same 3P5 who do not want the word genocide used during the Rwanda genocide. And here it's a little different. They're not blocking measures. There's just an unwillingness to go into Rwanda. In Darfur, it is more veto threats that are an issue. And when it comes to China, we see them operating much more with veto threats. And the problem with veto threats is they effectively block the council just as much as the actual veto, but the public doesn't know what's going on. So in Darfur, what we have are sanctions that get weakened by Chinese veto threats. We then have peacekeeping delayed by Chinese veto threats and a weakening of the peacekeeper mandate, with the peacekeepers arriving, of course, years after the height of the atrocities, which were 2003, 2004. Sri Lanka, Myanmar, again, we see relative passivity out of the Security Council, and these are due to veto threats. Myanmar, there's one actual veto, 2007, would have condemned the crimes. That gets vetoed, so the council can't even condemn what by now is identified as suspected genocide or reason to believe there is genocide according to the fact-finding mission. And when you can't even condemn the crimes, obviously the council will not be able to ratchet up to any additional measures. And it somewhat sends a proverbial green light to perpetrators on the ground. You have a protector on the council. So don't fear that the council will spring into activity. We see the most dispiriting set of vetoes related to Syria, the Russia vetoes, often accompanied by Chinese vetoes. They cannot condemn the crimes being committed. They cannot refer the situation to the International Criminal Court for investigation and prosecution. And then we have 6 vetoes blocking measures related to trying to prevent further chemical weapons attacks. And then we have vetoes blocking humanitarian assistance. You put this together and you say, is this the charter as it was designed to function? The US periodically uses the veto as relates to Israel, and I do in my book mean to cover all vetoes. And of course, most recently, we have seen Russia veto the condemnation of its own aggression. And again, you wonder, is this the charter as designed? So far to date, states have used what I call voluntary veto restraint, which is to commit not to use the veto in these situations as a political matter or as a soft law agreement. So we see this in the ACT Code of Conduct, which Liechtenstein also led, and it now I think has 122 states that agree not to use the veto, but it's a soft law document. And then the French-Mexican initiative with 105 states joining. And of course, also very helpful is Liechtenstein's new proposal of every veto cast simply have General Assembly discussion. And I think there we could see how the veto is being used in some ways extremely abusively. So my book looks at the veto within the context of the system of international law. And at 3 levels, it examines the veto as related to jus cogens. So our prohibitions of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and actually aggressive use of force contrary to the UN Charter, which comes up in the very most recent veto. These are at our highest level of jus cogens. They're peremptory norms of international law. It secondarily looks at the veto in the context of the remainder of the UN Charter as framed by its purposes and principles. And then thirdly, it looks at specific treaty obligations such as preventing genocide and the obligation to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. So my first argument is simply it is inconsistent to say these crimes are prohibited at the very highest level of the law, and yet you can freely veto. So, for example, you wouldn't expect the Security Council to endorse the commission of genocide. And in fact, it was Judge Lauterpacht in the Bosnia arms embargo case that said if there was one reading of one of the Security Council resolutions, he said, in imposing the arms embargo in Bosnia, which inadvertently was arming the better armed Serbian forces, which then committed the Srebrenica genocide. And Judge Lauterpacht said, if the Security Council unwittingly is aiding genocide, the resolution would be void. So just as we would not expect a Security Council resolution to endorse genocide, if you have genocide occurring, the Security Council has measures designed to try to prevent the crimes, and you block those, you're effectively endorsing the genocide. Yet the International Law Commission and the Articles of State Responsibility for Internationally Wrongful Acts preclude states from aiding and abetting serious breaches of peremptory norms or endorsing and maintaining a situation where these norms are being breached. Our veto is being used at odds with these principles. And applying, my book doesn't look at the most recent veto, but just simply applying these arguments would also apply to the most recent veto. In Russia, blocking its own condemnation is endorsing a situation where we have many provisions of the Charter being violated. Article 2.4, the purposes and principles, the first purpose of the UN to maintain security and collective measures So we have many, many breaches of the UN Charter occurring with Russia's act of aggression against the territory of Ukraine, and then the veto being used in effectively blocking any condemnation, somewhat allows the continuation of these violations. And of course, we're not even talking about, there was referral to the UK proposal for an aggression tribunal. The Security Council could have simply voted to refer the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, and that would have included crime of aggression jurisdiction. We wouldn't have needed to create a whole other tribunal as the UK proposes. Just to mention, there is a counter proposal to the UK proposal, which is that Ukraine and the UN should negotiate a treaty creating a separate tribunal on aggression, and the General Assembly could recommend it by way of the ECCC or Cambodia Tribunal, and not go down the kind of Nuremberg proposal that the UK has set forth. My second set of arguments in the book looks at the veto in the context of the remainder of the Charter. And the purposes and principles are binding on the Security Council as a whole. They're also binding on UN member states. In the end of the day, the permanent members are UN member states, so they are bound by the purposes and principles. And these include respecting international law. So I question, is a veto blocking measures designed to ameliorate genocide respecting international law? Obviously not, because there's an obligation to prevent genocide in Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. So I think there are many of the vetoes that seem at odds with other parts of the Charter. So the veto is found in the Charter, but it is not found in isolation over and above the entirety of the remainder of the Charter. And that's how it seems to be read in sanctioning continued perpetration of atrocity crimes. That I think is not a permissible reading of the UN Charter. And just to say, the book are of course my ideas, but by now there are many scholars and UN legal experts have actually endorsed my arguments. And I'm working with states to put these forward. And this is one of the arguments that I think they find most appealing, as states have been making statements on the record, such as Canada. Ambassador Ray said in the last R2P debate, the veto must be used in line with international law and the UN Charter. My third level of arguments relates to individual treaty obligations related to specific crimes, such as the Genocide Convention and obligation to prevent genocide, and the Geneva Conventions and the obligations to ensure respect for them. And I specifically argue a veto in the face of genocide or at least grave breaches in Common Article 3 violations would be at odds with these convention obligations. Crimes against humanity are equally as protected, I believe, under customary international law. Obviously, their convention is stalled in the drafting. The current draft has the obligation also to prevent crimes against humanity. And we have ICJ cases that these obligations are not just to prevent the crimes in your territory, but in the Wall in Nicaragua cases, it holds that you must prevent these crimes in other states. And of course, that was at issue in the Bosnia-Serbia case. It was Serbia's obligations to prevent genocide in Srebrenica, which by 1995 was a separate state. So it is an extraterritorial obligation. It's an obligation of due diligence to do what is in a country's power. So it's based on position of influence, and the permanent members have very weighty positions of influence that they could be using to prevent the crimes, not using their veto to endorse the crimes, essentially. So this needs to be addressed. I did write the Secretary General that he should just reflect this as one of the greatest challenges, and my suggestion was not picked up in the report. But in conclusion, in my book and in my working with states, I argue that states need to raise these arguments and express the view that international law matters and we need an re-examination of the veto power. The General Assembly could work up a resolution to this effect, or the General Assembly could send a question to the International Court of Justice on a question such as, is all veto use, while there's ongoing or the serious risk of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes consistent with international law? So thank you, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for this brilliant expose. And thank you for your book as well, which was really an eye-opener for me as well, to see the history of the veto and how we situate that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of my impression is that the vetoes during the Cold War, I will put it this way, were not so disastrous as the vetoes in the last 20 years. And you mentioned Darfur, Syria, Myanmar, and currently situation of Ukraine and Gaza before that. And I remember in one of my old articles, I was looking at vetoes during the 60s and 70s, and I was very much surprised to see vetoes coming for very mild and absolutely unnecessary texts. For example, there was a draft resolution on development of international law, very general text, which probably everybody would have agreed, but there was a Soviet Union veto. Then there was another text vetoed, and the resolution was about education and peace. My impression was that simply sometimes the big powers veto simply for the sake of the veto, somehow to impose themselves, to say we are important players, so we can do anything. But as you mentioned, the vetoes of the 21st centuries are really disastrous. More people die because of the veto today than back in the 50s and the 60s. And if you remember, the Kofi Annan report 2005 had a suggestion to limit the veto only to Chapter 7 situations, which is kind of the opposite what the French and Mexican proposal and ACT is today, that veto should not apply to the most serious R2P situations. So there is really an interesting shift. Back in 2005, we were thinking that, okay, you may have a veto, but only if it is survival situations for your own national security. Now it's the other way around. We demand the permanent five exactly not to veto the most serious situations. And I really will be happy to talk to you later after we finish with the initial exposés of everyone. Bruce, your time is now, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, and I'd like to thank you and Ankit and the International Law Society and the university for providing this opportunity to discuss this very, very urgent and important subject. For my presentation, I will be following up on what both Professors Groff and Professor Trahan have discussed about reforming the Security Council. Although my presentation will address the issues from the perspective of the UN General Assembly and its member states, focusing on reforms of the Security Council, both in terms of the enlargement of the Council to make it more representative of the world today, and also on the institutions of the permanent versus non-permanent seats, and of course, the veto. At the outset, it should be understood that the issues relating to the institutions of permanent members and versus non-permanent members, as well as the veto, are not new issues, as both of the previous speakers have articulated very well. They were hotly debated at the formation of the UN, and they've continued to arise and been discussed for the 77 years of the UN that has existed. The size of the Security Council has been a highly active issue since the 1960s. And all of these issues today remain before the General Assembly. At the outset, it is important to observe, as I think both previous speakers have noted, that it is difficult to make changes regarding the size of the Council and the institutions of permanent members and the veto, Putting aside for the moment the interesting arguments put forward by Professor Tran in her book and others that existing international law, in fact, already impose restraints on the exercise of the veto, I will address the issues and size of the composition and the council and the veto, that they can only be made, these changes, these reforms of these substantive matters can only be made in principle by an amendment through the charter. Such amendments require a supermajority of 2/3 of the member states. More importantly, they require the approval of all five permanent members. In the 77 years of the existence of the United Nations, there have been only 3 amendments to the charter: 1963, 1965, and 1971. Only one of those amendments, in 1963, dealt with reforming the Security Council. That amendment enlarged the membership of the Council from the original 10 to 15. There have, however, been a number of proposals to expand the Council and reform the institutions of the permanent member seats, as well as the veto, throughout the 77 years. In addition, there have been proposals over the years to address working methods of the Council, to enhance the transparency of the Council's work and coordination between the Council and the General Assembly. A number of those proposals, none of which require an amendment to the Charter, have been adopted by both the Security Council and the General Assembly. The current initiative to reform the Council was launched in 1979 with a decision by the General Assembly to include that specific item on its agenda. The General Assembly, however, did not in fact take up that subject in earnest until 1992 with the end of the Cold War. In 1993, the General Assembly established an open-ended working group to address these matters. Over the following 15 years or so, the open-ended working group made some progress on the issues relating to working methods and transparency, but not on the more substantive issues of enlargement of the Council and the veto. In 2004, a high-level panel established by the organization to deal with threats, challenges, and change in the organization, in its report to the Generalization, called upon the 5 permanent members to commit voluntarily to restrain from invoking the veto in cases of genocide and large-scale human rights abuses. That same panel also recommended that any new permanent members of the Council be among those states that contributed most to the United Nations financially, militarily, and diplomatically, particularly through contributions to the UN budget and through participation in peacekeeping missions. In addition, they recommended that any new permanent members represent the broader UN membership, and that any enlargement, and this is key, any enlargement not impaired the effectiveness of the Council. Notably, effectiveness has been understood, at least by the permanent 5, to limit the size of the Council so that it would not be so large as to encourage endless policy debates. Intensive discussion on the subject of the Security Council reform continued within the General Assembly over the following years, but with little progress. In 2008, the President of the General Assembly issued a working paper that identified 5 key issues to be addressed: categories of membership, the question of the veto, regional representation, the size of an enlarged Council, and the working methods of the Council and its relationship with the General Assembly. These are essentially the same issues that confronted the General Assembly in 1979 at the beginning of that renewed initiative, some 30 years earlier, and the same issues which confront the General Assembly even today. Over the last 20 years or so, the General Assembly has focused on certain proposals to reform the Security Council. The G4 proposal, initiated by Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, calls for increasing the size of the Council by 10 seats, raising it from 15 to 25 seats, calling for 6 new national permanent seats for the economically strongest and most influential countries: 2 from Africa, 2 from Asia, one from the Latin American and the Caribbean group, the so-called GRULAC group, and one from the Western European and other group, the so-called WEOG group. New permanent seats would enjoy the same rights of veto as the permanent 5 now enjoy. The 4 sponsors of the G4 proposal put themselves forward as to have 4 of those 6 seats. The proposal included 4 new non-permanent seats, 2 for Africa, 1 from Asia, and 1 from the GRULAC. The African Union proposal calls for an increase in the Security Council from 15 to 26 seats to be distributed among the UN's 5 internationally recognized regional groups, with 6 new permanent seats to be allocated, again, 2 for Africa, 2 for Asia, 1 for the GRULAC, and 1 for WEOG. It also calls for 5 new non-permanent seats, 2 for Africa, 1 for Asia, 1 for Eastern European group, and 1 for the GRULAC. Another proposal, the Uniting for Consensus proposal, sponsored by 40 states, calls for retaining the 5 permanent seats, but increasing the number of non-permanent seats from 10 to 20 for a total of 25 seats. The 20 non-permanent seats are to be allocated 6 for Africa, 6 for Asia, 6 for Africa, 5 for Asia, 4 for GRULAC, 3 for the WEOG, and 2 for the Eastern European group. Each regional group would elect their members on a rotational basis for a period of 3 to 5 years without the possibility of re-election. So where are we today on Security Council reform? To date, little progress has been made on the enlargement of the Council or reform of the veto. The principal obstacle to achieving enlargement of the Council lies not with the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. They have all endorsed, in principle, the enlargement of the Council, with the caveat that any such enlargement should not undermine the effectiveness of the Council. The United States and Russia have supported only a modest expansion, suggesting that it be no greater than the low 20s, 21 or 22. The permanent members have also generally endorsed the suggestion that any new permanent members take into account the candidate's ability to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. Generally, the permanent 5, except for the UK and France, defer to the General Assembly and its regional groups to work this matter out, subject to the caveat that the expansion should not undermine the effectiveness of the Council. The UK and France, on the other hand, have endorsed the G4 proposal, including specifically support for the 4 sponsors of that proposal, Brazil, India, Japan, and Germany, to occupy 4 of those new 6 proposed national seats, permanent seats. With regard to expansion, the problem principally lies with the inability of the regional groups within the General Assembly to agree among themselves. The members of the General Assembly, particularly the G77, which represents 132 of the 193 member states and includes states from every regional group except for the WEOG, have not been able to agree on any proposal. Even within the WEOG, there is disagreement as to whether there should be an additional seat for the WEOG and who would occupy that seat. Nor have any regional groups expressed support for any particular proposal, although the AU proposal may be viewed as having the support of the African group in principle. The problem remains that the AU proposal does not identify which African states would occupy the new permanent seats, a controversial issue within that group that would need to be resolved before the proposal could move forward, even within that group. It appears that the regional groups within the Assembly are not close to resolving the many differences within and among them as to how and how much to expand the Security Council membership, making it unlikely that there will be any such expansion in the near future. With regard to the veto, 2 of the 5 permanent members, US and Russia, firmly and publicly oppose any tampering with the veto. China has been more coy, but has expressed skepticism of even voluntary restraints on the veto. Only the UK and France have publicly voiced support for restraining the use of the veto, and only in terms of a voluntary restraint to exercise the veto, not any formal legal restraints by amending the charter. Thus, the prospects for achieving success on this issue appear dim, if not dead. Nonetheless, the issue has continued to draw widespread support within the General Assembly. The S5 proposal in 1979 by Costa Rica, Jordan, Liechtenstein, Singapore, and Sweden called for veto restraint in the face of atrocity crimes, as well as reforms that focused on the working methods of the Council. The S5 proposal was formally endorsed at that time by only some 25 member states and was withdrawn in 2012. However, the proposal was essentially revived a few years later, in 2015, by a proposal from the ACT Group, formed by 24 member states and led by Liechtenstein. The ACT Group proposed a code of conduct. At its heart, the code contains a general and positive pledge to support Security Council action against genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, to seek to prevent and punish those who are engaged in those crimes. The code calls upon the permanent members to not veto Security Council resolutions that are aimed at preventing these crimes. As Professor Tran has pointed out, the code is supported by some 120 members of the General Assembly. Notably, among those supporting the code of conduct are 2 permanent members, UK and France, 2 of the 4 sponsors of the G4 proposal, Japan and Germany, many members that supported the AU proposal and the Uniting for Consensus proposals, covering all the regional groups of the General Assembly, including the WEOC. In addition, during the same period, a separate initiative, as Professor Tran has pointed out, by France and Mexico, calling for voluntary restraint by the permanent members in relation to such crimes, has attracted similar widespread support within the General Assembly. In conclusion, unfortunately, the prospect for achieving substantive reforms of the Security Council, either in enlarging the Council or in regard to the institutions of the permanent member seat or the veto, are not good. This does not mean that reform is not possible. What is required for even a chance of significant reform is perseverance, as is always the case with the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for this long historical voyage from back in the 1960s till now. Interesting lesson from that moment when, for the first and only time, the Security Council was enlarged from 11 to 15 members, was that 4 out of the 5 permanent members were not supportive in the beginning. They voted either against or abstaining in the General Assembly, but nevertheless, when the General Assembly adopted the resolution to expand from 11 to 15 members, the Council, those who were initially against came into ratification anyway. In other words, somehow the problem are not only the permanent 5 that will probably be against again and again, but also the lack of unity in the General Assembly, which was very united back in the 1960s, but it's not united today, probably exactly because we have kind of 2 models. One is the G4 model of permanent members, and the other is the Uniting for Consensus model. And somehow the General Assembly itself is divided and cannot reach the 2/3 majority necessary to adopt such a resolution. And that's a good lesson to remember, that we don't need first to persuade the P5. We need first to get united in the General Assembly and then probably push the P5 to accept the proposal. Anyway, Richard Kaplan is next. Please, Richard.
Thank you, Vezin. I want to just start by thanking you for organizing this, you and Ankit. I think, as you said, it is very timely. I can't think of when it wouldn't be timely, but all the more so in view of of current events. Now, you, Veslin, you've asked me to reflect on UN reform with a focus on the UN peace architecture. And what I'm going to do is I'll make a couple of comments from inside the box, so to speak, and then I'll close with one comment from outside the box. And just to begin with, we tend to think of reform in terms of creating or restructuring institutions. But I think it's important to recognize that reform can also be achieved with shifts in discourse. And Guterres, I think, has done just that with his emphasis on prevention. Now, coming into office, Guterres made prevention a top priority. And conflict prevention is now understood not only in terms of averting the outbreak of violent conflict, but also the continuation, the escalation, and the recurrence of conflict. And in doing so, Guterres had to overcome really decades of reluctance, of hesitation to focus on prevention, because prevention was seen by many, especially the more vulnerable states in the UN, as a kind of thin edge of the wedge, as a threat, possible instrument of intervention. So there was a lot of caution. And I think, as I said, he's done very, very well in overcoming, assuaging a lot of those concerns. And he's recognized that in order for the UN to shift from a largely reactive posture to a more prevention-oriented approach, it'll need to better integrate its various peace and security-related pillars of work. And that's what he's sought to do. And one concrete reform in this spirit, and you've mentioned this in your opening remarks, has been the merger of the Department of Political Affairs, DPA, and the Peacebuilding Support Office, the PBSO, to create the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, DPPA. Now, broadly speaking, I think that the results have been positive. PBSO is now much closer to the DPA regional desks, and there's intense consultation on the political aspects of the work of the PBSO, and that's all for the better. In addition, the Peacebuilding Commission, the PBC, I think has benefited from the active support of the regional divisions, for instance, the Africa desk. Now, some would say that the Secretary General should have gone even further and merged the Department of Political Affairs with what was then Department of Peacekeeping Operations, but that was thought to be too bold a move. But as a result of not having done that, I think the top leadership still operates in siloed fashion. So, for instance, when management of a conflict situation moves from DPPA to what is now the Department of Peace Operations, DPPA's knowledge of the situation doesn't move with it. And another example is that DPA has a gender a policy, DPO has a gender a policy, but really what's needed, and this is relevant to a lot of other issue areas, is an overarching peace and security gender policy. So more could be done to enhance the role of the UN in conflict prevention. The Stimson Institute suggested the introduction of a sustaining peace and conflict prevention audit tool, which would be similar to the way that the Human Rights Council works with its Universal Periodic Review instrument. The audit tool would employ early warning conflict indicators for greater early action to prevent conflict outbreak and escalation. And as with the Universal Periodic Review, countries would participate periodically in audits of early warning indicators. Now, this might seem quixotic, but the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has developed its own guidelines for early warning, allowing for more systematic and structured approach to the identification of potential conflicts and crisis situations in the area where it works. And a number of years ago, it rolled out a conflict analysis toolkit and a set of early warning indicators for use in the organization's field operations. This was in response to the Georgia crisis of 2008, which by its own admission caught the organization off guard. So this has been a very, well, relatively speaking, successful attempt to be able to identify early on the emergence of a crisis situation. Now, it may not seem very significant, and indeed I was initially skeptical, but the notion of sustaining peace represents, I think, another meaningful shift in discourse, starting with the April 2016 General Assembly and Security Council peacebuilding resolutions. Many of the UN's funds, programs, and specialized agencies have been focusing on sustaining peace at all stages of conflict and in all its dimensions. And just to give you one example that I'm familiar with from my own personal experience, the World Food Program, the WFP, doesn't have a mandate for peace building, but because the World Food Program works primarily in fragile, conflict-affected, and complex settings, it's highly peace proximate, as it says. In other words, its work impinges on peace, if only because food security can contribute to the resilience necessary to make peace possible or not. And the WFP is increasingly aware of its peace proximity and is taking it into account in the work that it does. And I think this is a significant shift in orientation for the WFP, and it's not limited to the WFP. The WHO, UNICEF, ILO, and other UN bodies have all been taking a much more, if you will, holistic view and integrating sustaining peace into their mandated activities. So, as I said, this constitutes, I think, a form of reform in itself. Now, it's difficult to talk about the reform of the UN peace architecture without talking about sustainable financing of core UN activities. I know this is not a very sexy topic, but it is a vitally important one. Within the UN system, the imbalance between conflict prevention and conflict response is really dramatic. The budget for UN peacekeeping this year is $6.38 billion, which even by itself is not a lot when you compare to the size of a lot of national governments' defense budgets. But nonetheless, it is a lot for the UN. Indeed, it's greater, as it always is, than the budget for the rest of the UN system. And of course, it's hard to calculate how much is spent on conflict prevention and peace building, since some portion of many agencies' budgets is dedicated to this. And peacekeeping operations themselves, some of their monies go to some peace building activities, such as the monitoring of police and judges, technical advice on human rights, gender and political processes, disarmament, and so forth. So it is difficult to sometimes separate out exactly what is earmarked for peace building. But the largest pot of dedicated of money for prevention and peace building, the UN Peacebuilding Fund, totaled $210 million in 2021, and that's less than 4% of the peacekeeping budget. Now, the SG in the most recent report, Common Agenda, has proposed assessed funding for the Peacebuilding Fund. And even though this is arguably a rather modest proposition, there's insufficient support among member states, even for this initiative. Digital technologies and data for peacekeeping are another important area of current reform efforts. The idea here is to harness the potential of data and new technologies to enhance peacekeeping effectiveness in a number of ways. First, by producing better real-time analysis of the conflict environment, and there's been some very promising proposals for the use of machine learning for this purpose and artificial intelligence, but that hasn't come on stream yet. Second, by producing more accurate assessments of peacekeeping performance for planning and decision-making purposes, such as represented by CPAS, the Comprehensive Performance Analysis Program. And third, to be able to address digital challenges, such as the weaponization of technologies by non-state actors, cyber attacks, misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And finally, to strengthen the safety and security of peacekeeping personnel. So all of this coming under the aegis of digital technologies and data. Now, these are just some brief reflections, very much, as I said, from within the box. And my final reflection is outside the box. Many years ago, you remember UN Undersecretary General Brian Urquhart proposed the establishment of a UN volunteer force. He wasn't the first to do this, but it was probably the most prominent expression of support for this idea. As he put it, such a force would be deployed only with the Security Council's authorization, but because it was a volunteer force, the volunteer status of the force would relieve national governments of the inhibiting concerns that they had about or would have about casualties and open-ended commitments, the sorts of concerns that now make them unwilling to approve peacekeeping operations or to commit their own troops to these operations. And it would also ensure that the peacekeepers are trained to a common high standard. The volunteers could even be drawn from existing national forces. That was another possibility. Now, I know that the political climate is not right. When will it ever be? But I do think that it's a good idea that deserves to be kept alive, precisely because it would help to overcome national aversion to troop deployments when they could make a critical difference. So I would certainly like to see this idea getting renewed attention. And I'll just say in closing, I mean, we were invited to participate in this very interesting roundtable many months ago, well before the current crisis in the Ukraine. It is hard to see with so many reform initiatives underway at the moment with our common agenda, talk about how that now will be implemented, the new agenda for peace having to still be very thoroughly thought through. It's difficult, however, to see how a lot of these UN reform efforts in the area of peace and security, anyway, even the less ambitious ones, can move forward in view of the recent and ongoing violation of a cornerstone principle of international peace and security by one of the major UN powers. So we shall see, but that will obviously, as it is at the moment, continue to dominate our thoughts and the work, I'm sure, of the United Nations. So
thank you.
I leave it at that.
Thank you, Richard. This is really excellent. Your presentation about the peace and security architecture and the need to probably revisit this in the context of the war in Ukraine. And hopefully that will happen pretty quickly now, because there was no such a probably strong driver before that. It was very much academic discussion, but now very senior political circles will be looking at the proposals and what to do with the United Nations. I cannot agree more with you. And actually, I'm very happy the way we so far go with our discussion, because it very much helps me also to present what I wanted initially to present. But let me start somehow from the finish and go to the start. Interestingly, the focus on prevention you mentioned, Richard, is important. By the way, it's not only Guterres. Ban Ki-moon was talking a lot about prevention, and Kofi Annan. So it's kind of another long story. What we would like to see probably is somehow to have the two sets of agencies dealing on one hand with reaction to the fire that already burns, and sets of agency dealing with investigating the causes of the fire so that the fire doesn't start again. So the peace building, which is an effort for conflict not to re-emerge, is a very broad. It can include almost anything in the UN system, which is supposed to, for example, rule of law, human rights, development, political democratization, all demilitarization, rehabilitation, justice. All of these efforts of the UN system are, in fact, making possible the peace to sustain and the conflict not to re-emerge. So it's really a large effort from many, many agencies. And on the other hand, we have the Security Council still as a body to act quickly in emergencies, if it is efficient, to stop the fire. So in a way, we need the fire brigade to go and stop the fire if a house is burning. But then we need to have also the investigators to find out what were the causes of the fire, what was the building construction, what is the electricity system failure, and to fix all of those issues. So prevention is, and I will regard prevention and peace building as one. It's basically the same silo, that they shouldn't be very, very different. Prevention is actually the conflict not to happen again, and peace building is prevention also for the conflict not to happen again. And for that matter, when I was writing, well, let me start now from the beginning. When I was looking at the Security Council reform back 7-8 years ago, part of my frustration was exactly what I just said, this division between half of the world talking about G4 and permanent new members, 6 of them, 2 from Africa, although Africa never named those 2, and all the problems connected with that model, the regional conflicts between, for example, India and Pakistan, or Japan and China, or Brazil and Spanish Latin America, and not much prospect for progress there. And also the other part, which is the uniting for consensus and the idea of renewable membership, and no permanent members, but longer standing members that are staying for long terms and are renewed, and they can also contribute, which is an excellent idea. But again, it didn't gather enough support. So my proposal at the time, named 8+8+8, was an attempt to synergetically bring the two together. Some permanent new members, including regional, like African Union, for example, or European Union, acting as one seat in the council, plus Brazil, India, Japan, China, United States, and Russia. But then 8 seats go to large countries and willing to contribute more, such as Germany, Argentina, South Africa, Nigeria, Indonesia, Singapore, Pakistan, South Korea, countries that rotate over 8 years. So 8, and they can stay for another 8, making 16, or another 8, making 24, a generational participation in the council, and then another group of 8, 2 years, non-renewable members as they are now. Again, I propose that. I see a lot of strength in the proposal. It helps all the regional groups, by the way. It's better for Africa to be that way. They don't need to decide 2 members once and forever, which they never did, by the way, for the last 16 years. They can have African Union membership permanently, forever, plus Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, being in the rotational group, effectively having more or less 2 permanent members in this sense. Same in Europe. European Union membership is firm, permanent, forever, plus Germany, France, Britain, Italy, rotating in the second category of seats, and same for Latin America. with having Brazil as permanent plus, long-term standing Argentina, Mexico, and so on. And good for Asia with Japan and India permanent members, plus South Korea, Indonesia, Pakistan, and other long-term 8+8+8 renewable seats. Of course, it didn't work much. I tried hard. I presented it probably 100 times. A lot of sympathy among academics and not much sympathy among the diplomats. And then looking at that back, I found that it's never going to work. I got very skeptic and I proposed something else. I said, okay, let's leave the Security Council as anachronistic and inefficient as it is. I will not touch that anymore. But I suggested alternative councils. I called that paper Multiple Security Council, suggesting a shift in the agenda. All right, the P5 don't want to reform, they will stay where they stay. We leave them there, let them shout and make scandals in that room. But we need to take soft security issues elsewhere. And I propose a peace-building council, which will be an upgrade from the Peace-Building Commission, a health security council dealing with pandemics and health emergencies, and climate security council dealing with climate change and all the environmental disasters that Maya presented earlier today. So new bodies created by the General Assembly. Again, all the P5 are welcome to have permanent seats in those two, but then we have larger contributors, countries such as Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the rest, taking more role on such issues, which are not really hard security issues. And here comes the beauty of that proposal is, for example, for Japan, which never ever had constitutionally much role to play in hard security anyway. They cannot participate in troops abroad. For them, that model will be perfect. They don't need to knock on the door and ask for permanent membership in the current Security Council. By the way, I used to teach in Japan, and often students ask me, what do I think about this Japanese membership in the Security Council? And my answer to that was, in fact, why do you want to join that group? Look who is there. Russia, China, United States at the time of Donald. Do you really want to be part of such a club? Probably not. You are so beautiful and so peaceful that you better not, your message should be, until you guys get better, then I will join you. I don't want to join you now. Look at what you're doing. Look at the veto you're imposing. It's not the Council Japan admire to join. And in a model where you have alternative councils, when you can participate in full force in peace building, and Japan did, it was the first chair of the Peace Building Commission. If you participate with full force in climate issues, in pandemics and health issues, that will be quite much satisfying the Japanese contribution to the world security. And that will also relieve the current security councils from that. We're kind of pushing the council to take climate change seriously or to take pandemic serious. Well, they did. There were resolutions by the Security Council on HIV, on Ebola, not much on COVID-19 because the problem came between Donald Trump and the Chinese. But instead of, again, pushing the Security Council to take everything, all the vast soft security agenda, once we have different bodies dealing with that, then the Security Council can only focus on the Chapter 7 and on the most urgent issues, imposing sanctions or authorizing use of force, which it was supposed to do anyway. And then looking at where do we stand now? The proposals by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres very much, I think, follow this idea of having organs that will deal with emergencies, such as the emergency platform, but also with organs which will deal more long-term, preventive or peace building, such as what he suggested as a repurposed trusteeship council to take issues of the future generations, including climate change, including the youth as another actor in international relations. The idea of a summit to renegotiate and re-sign the social contract. So this attention to the future with the repurposing of the Trusteeship Council, I found extremely admirable, unique. First, never ever any Secretary General was talking so much about the future. And it's time to talk about future because the future is coming. It's knocking on our door. We see the impacts already hitting us, the floodings, the heats, the fires, the deforestation. The climate change is not something which will hit the world in 2030 or 2050. It's already on our doorstep. So it's very important to put that agenda into place. And obviously, I support very much similar proposals such as the Resilience Council. The Global Resilience Council is an excellent idea, which very much fits into what I used to talk as a Climate Security Council. The idea about Global Environmental Agency, which I think is in Amaya's book as well, how the Global Environmental Agency can unite various bodies in the UN system, but also outside the UN system as to address. So we need those separate tables from the Security Council to deal with all long-term and softer securities issues so that we don't burden the current Security Council and leave it as it is. Although I still support the ideas for working methods, restriction of the veto as suggested. I'm not abandoning that agenda. I'm simply skeptical about that agenda. And that's why I would like to see something moving forward. I don't want to talk about the same issues for 25 and 30 years. And I kind of see what back in 1992, as Bruce mentioned, the beginning of this long, open-ended group to discuss the equitable, which some call it even never-ending group for equitable representation already. So to have something moving, I support the ideas, those who are kind of reformulated in the Secretary General, our common agenda. And the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the whole memories, this brings back we are back into kind of a Second World War moment. Some would even call it a Copernican moment. In those crises, we realize where we are and what we need to do and how to achieve that. So I very much hope so that this moment will be utilized by willing states. And we see the coalitions already forming and establishing. We see also the reform agenda move forward. And even that report of the Secretary General is now a little bit need to be revised, as Richard mentioned. The new agenda for peace, which was mentioned but not very much elaborated in the report of the Secretary General, might also become a central task for all of us as academics, but also as possible influencers to our policymakers. Okay, I'm not very good, by the way, in timekeeping, and I don't know where we are. Oh, sorry, we're almost done. Ankit, back to you. Please discipline our talk and tell us what to do next. And if there are some questions, I'm happy to.
Well, let me just thank all our speakers for sharing their thoughts with us. And I'll just pose two general questions, which I'll welcome any of the speakers to answer. First of these being that even if you are looking at any sort of reform, then you need a policy of appeasement or some sort of a roadmap which would make sense to the Security Council members. so that they can invest in this idea. So how does one go about this idea of appeasement? Or do you, in some sense, are as frustrated as Professor Pulaski and choose to just say, okay, you do what you have to, we'll look at other solutions and work from that? Second, being on sanctions, I'm quite interested to see how sanctions have now developed as a war strategy, and the effectiveness of this mechanism in a system wherein sanctions are necessarily replaced full-blown war.
Can I just clarify your first question? Is it what you mean is appeasement or rather negotiations and diplomacy?
Well, both.
Before going to sanctions, we need to try like a last chance for negotiation and peace. And if that doesn't work, then somehow to move from chapter 6 to chapter 7. Is that where that line stands? So
indeed, and also if appeasement in terms of the creation of a separate council altogether. So do you appease those 5 members, or do you just negate them and say, okay, we will try to sort of do this on our own and on our own steam? Or do you get support from them as well, and then work in cohesion and in unity? And the second question is on sanctions and smart sanctions, and the effectiveness of this sanction regime in the face of war. And also one question specifically to Professor Trahan, since he's touched upon this on the London proposal for a special tribunal. I'll be very interested to hear others also speak about this as a sort of a mechanism to deter the situation which we find ourselves now in.
Maybe I'll take a first crack and everybody else can join in. As I understood your question, as elaborated by Professor Popovsky, is one of your first questions was how to enlist or bring the Security Council into a reform mode. And I think that is a thankless task, as Professor Popovsky has suggested, especially when it engages the interest, the vital interest, or the interest of any of the permanent 5. And Ukraine is the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all over again in terms of engaging the vital interests. So how do you do that? And I think there's no way around this. I'm a little like Professor Popovsky. I think there's no way. The permanent 5 has gone as far as they're going to go. And I like Professor Popovsky's idea that if you can get the General Assembly to have a consensus, we can drag along the Security Council as they did in 1963. That's a possibility. But other than that, I don't see the ability to drag the Security Council along, especially given what's the nature of the Security Council today. As far as sanctions go, I think the issue today is not the Security Council sanctions. What the Russian example is not Security Council sanctions, but the sanctions of Western financial powers being able to impose sanctions that are crippling on a country like Russia, one of the supposed superpowers. And some people call that economic warfare. And how far they can push that and how far that will go, I'd be interested in a discussion of where they see that going ultimately, and how that contributes to a solution in the Ukraine. I'd be interested in that too. Those are the answers to your questions. I had some other answers to questions raised by others, but I will now defer and let some other people speak.
So if I'm permitted to weigh in on reform of the Security Council and veto, so I'm equally pessimistic, which is why I'm not proposing reform. I'm proposing going to the International Court of Justice for a ruling from the outside that there's a problem with how the veto is being used. I don't think you bring the P5. I agree, they've gone as far as they want. 2 P5 endorse voluntary veto restraint. The other 3 P5 are not going to. So this whole voluntary initiative is hitting a roadblock. I don't think they're going to reform themselves internally. So I propose going outside and seeking a ruling. The ICJ apparently ruled while we were on our panel that Russia must immediately cease its aggression in Ukraine. So the ICJ can be a courageous body. So maybe they could look at vetoes as well. Part two, we'll have to see whether this changes on the ground reality at all. We don't probably have time really to go into it, but just to say in terms of accountability in Ukraine, because Ankit raised these, we have both the International Criminal Court investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. There's a new proposal that states would direct funding only to the investigations they like because states want to give extra funding there. I actually think that's really problematic. And if you believe in the International Criminal Court, you have to just fund it overall and not kind of try to shape it, stock it. There are two different separate tribunal proposals, the UK proposal, and then I am working with the ever mighty Liechtenstein on the idea of Ukraine and the UN agreeing to one, and then the GA possibly endorsing that. And then in the long run, I think the events point to the need to change the jurisdictional provision of the Rome Statute on the crime of aggression so that we don't just have to create special tribunals when Russia invades, but we actually have Article 2.4 of the UN Charter enforced across the boards. And we fix the jurisdictional carve-outs that actually the US created in the Kampala Review Conference and fix that and restore the fourth crime to its rightful place in the Rome Statute, having jurisdiction akin to that of the other three crimes. So
I would very much support this too. In fact, I will add even more. There should be pressures coming from other parts of the UN. If the Security Council doesn't do the work, obviously it's not alone. There are many other options. Let me add to the list, which Bruce and Jennifer already mentioned, regional organizations. They can do more. And actually, it's not new. They did more. For example, the conflict in Liberia in early 1990s was addressed initially by the ECOWAS, the Economic Organization of the Western African States. And only a year or 18 months later, Security Council finally realized that there is a conflict there and somebody else is taking our job. So let's jump in and basically support what ECOWAS was already doing for a long time. Another situation was Haiti in 1994. Again, the Organization of American States came first and only later the Security Council joined that effort. So regional organization and obviously ASEAN dealing with Myanmar much more successfully than the Security Council throughout those years. So regional organization, ICJ was mentioned, ICC was mentioned, the General Assembly obviously can do more. The President of the General Assembly, the recent presidents of the General Assembly have become more proactive, putting agenda on peace and security in the deliberation. The debates on the R2P, the annual reports of the Secretary General. And let me give you also an interesting example. The last selection of a Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he was selected, it was not the P5 making that choice. It's the opposite. The 10 non-permanent members made the choice of Antonio Guterres. In fact, all the P5 had their own protégés. Russia wanted Irina Bokova, United Kingdom wanted Helen Clark, United States wanted Susanna Malcora. But at the end, if you look at the straw polls, only Guterres scored high in all 6 or 7 straw polls, which means that even with the initial reluctance of China and Russia and possibly other permanent members, it was the 10 non-permanent supporting Guterres every single time, but also not supporting the others. Everybody else got 6 or 7 or 5. So the selection of the last Secretary General very much happened because the P5 at the end gave up and said, we cannot fight with the 10 because you need still to score 9 out of 15. And without the non-permanent, you cannot go anywhere. And I guess the selection of the Secretary General really can go out of hands of the permanent 5 even next time, and even out of the hands of the Security Council and be done by the General Assembly itself. I made I remember the one for 7 billion, but also others were talking about changes in that process as well, with more than one candidate being given to the General Assembly, so that the General Assembly makes the final choice of the Secretary General, and having a longer single term so that there is no problem with re-election after 5 years, so that the Secretary General stay longer being selected by the General Assembly. So there are signals that some issues can really go elsewhere, exactly having in mind the division and paralysis of the Security Council.
Can I make a few comments? Thanks a lot. Yeah, extremely interesting. And when it comes to Security Council reform, general UN reform, I think one important fact to keep in mind is that this privileged place of the P5, including in terms of reform of the Charter, amendments to the Charter, is by conscious design. It's built into this. It's not a bug. It's consciously built into the system. So I think indeed all these ways to think for the international community, the greater international community, to think creatively and proactively, how can we use the other parts of the system to put more and more pressure on the Security Council. And we see this happening, the Security Council and the P5 and the veto usage is more and more delegitimized and criticized. So we definitely see a norm accretion in terms of this is not a legitimate form of apex international governance. And also, if I recall correctly, 2 of the 3 successful UN Charter reforms, albeit relatively minor, that have happened at first had opposition from the P5 members, and then they gradually acquiesced over time or gave in. This phenomenon of so the General Assembly, in terms of very targeted sorts of amendments to suggest to the Charter, perhaps has more power if it wishes to agree and to build a consensus around some key issues, which of course is another huge challenge. And just one other point in terms of the actors in these sort of reform dialogues and processes, including in terms of the Security Council reform, we haven't seen a really robust civil society global movement in terms of the Security Council or the ICJ. For obvious reasons, they're sort of more fundamental structural institutions. But I remember one of the CICC leaders talking about the ILC, the International Law Commission, as a place where good ideas go to die, right? So the UN system is not, the most vibrant, vigorous place sometimes to generate good ideas and see them through to completion. So I think it's interesting with the OCA follow-up, but not only like how do academics also work more with civil society and states and smart coalitions to also, but it's also basic generating understanding about the key principles, like the referral to the key purposes, principles of the United Nations Charter. Of course, the Security Council should be abiding by these to generate also the knowledge amongst broader civil society about, what's at stake and where, we should be moving to have a more legitimate rules-based international order. Yeah.
Could I follow up on that? And my concern, I take your point about the delegitimization of the use of the veto and other practices. My concern is that what may happen as a consequence is not that the pressure will build to a reform, but that the sentiment will extend more broadly to delegitimization of the UN itself. And that, I mean, I don't know when, in a case like the one that we're witnessing, the perceived vital interests of one of the major powers of one of the P5 is at stake. how you get around that, really, because I think if you look back over the history of the United Nations, it really has required consensus. And I think I take your point, was it you, Maya, who said at the outset that it isn't a bug of the system. Indeed, it was very much, indeed, if you look at the League of Nations and the closing, I think it was, session of the League, there was a very strong wish for a United Nations, a successor organization, or in the interim period over the discussions, where there would be a mechanism precisely to protect the vital interests. In other words, they recognize that this was one of the weaknesses of the League, and so, as you say, it's inbuilt, but it has worked best. And we look back to that heyday period, the early years of the post-Cold War, so-called 1992, where there was quite a lot of consensus, political consensus, enabling countries to come together that are now at loggerheads. But I worry that what's happening is going to call the institution into greater disrepute. And I don't know, particularly in light of this experience, how we reach a point where we can restore sufficient consensus so that the organization can function effectively.
And this brings exactly the kind of more radical voices and people suggesting that we really need to draft a new charter. We need to dismiss the United Nations and start afresh. Kind of. Are we in that Copernican moment? I don't know, but that's one way of looking at that. The organization created in 1945 is no longer fit for purpose, and we need a new one. We need to redraft the UN Charter. Again, very radical, very difficult, I agree, proposal. So in a sense, but the pressures will go on. I'm sure that if the Security Council doesn't function, there will be those other organs within and outside the UN system that will take more role. And one suggestion is, if the Special Court for Ukraine finds out a crime of aggression, and I don't see who will not find that, it's so clear. No judge in the world probably will kind of dismiss and not see an aggression in an absolutely blatant textbook example of an aggression. How will the Security Council feel if the international, any tribunal finds out a crime of aggression, whereas the security, after years, kind of doing the post-conflict justice work and finding a crime of aggression, and the Security Council itself, which is supposed exactly to determine threats to the peace and acts of aggression, doesn't do it. It's very embarrassing for a body to wait for a tribunal years later to find out a crime of aggression, something which the Security Council didn't address in the first place.
I think the theme is all here. Only the petition to the United Nations needs to be made, and work can start on the reform of the Council. With those words, I thank our esteemed panelists for taking out time to do this. We will most certainly keep in touch, and we extend an invitation to everyone here to our university, which is now open and functioning in hybrid mode. Professor Popowski, the final word is now yours. You are the father of the society and also its endeavors. So the final word can only be yours.
Well, my final word is thank you, Ankit, for bringing us together, and thank you all the panelists for making time in those busy days to be with us. Thank you, the society, for listening. It's really crucial time to revisit a lot of what we have been studying and writing, and how to make this possible is also a major task. And we can do our part, we can write books and articles, but also it's up to the policymakers, and we have to influence them as well without delay to take the necessary action so that the world is safe and peaceful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Everybody,
Thank you so
Great
much.
panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.